Hello, this is Mr. Philippek, and this video is on the power of flowers. And yes, that is my picture. Anyway, slide is showing the overall structure of a flower. You'll notice flowers are rather complex, and it's because they have to trick pollinators into getting pollen from their anthers and somehow delivering it to another part of the female part of the plant, the stigma. The next few slides are going to talk to us about the general structure of a flower. The sepals are the outermost part of the flower. It protects the flower when it's growing through dirt. And again, if you don't know what dirt is, basically it's just pulverized rock. And so the sepals, because dirt is pulverized rock, protects it as the young bud is coming up through the ground. It also protects this young flower from growing, damage from insects, drying out. Really, the life of a flower is pretty rough. Okay, now petals, on the other hand, is what we're usually familiar with. It's the bright part of the flower. Oftentimes they have some sort of scent. Usually if somebody has fresh flowers in their home, you can usually smell them like, wow, it really smells nice. The idea, though, is that these flower parts are meant to attract pollinators. And these pollinators are the organisms that are going to take the pollen and then try to cross-fertilize these flowers so they can grow more flowers. Oftentimes, as the slide says here, that these flower parts have perfume or nectar, all right, but they also provide a really nice surface for the insects to rest on when they're trying to feed. Now, the male part of the flower is called the stamen, and this contains the pollen-producing anther, which is at the tip, and then attached to the anther is this long thing called the filament. Now, the filament is the stalk that holds the anther way up into the air for the hope that when the pollen grains mature, and for those of you who have allergies, you'll know what I'm talking about. When those pollen grains mature and the wind comes and can carry it, the filament has to stick way out there to kind of have the pollen grains exposed to the wind. The female part of the plant is called the pistil, and it actually has three parts. The first part is called the stigma, and this is the sticky part at the very top that provides an area where pollen grains can land. When pollen grains land, they begin to form a tube down this tube called the style. Oftentimes we say the sperm within the pollen travels in style down to the ovary. And so the style connects the stigma to the ovary, which eventually becomes the fruit of this plant. Inside the ovary, there's a series of ovules, and when they become fertilized, they develop into the seeds. But the whole thing, the stigma, the style, and the ovary, all three of these things are all referred to as the pistil. So what actually is pollination? Well, what happens is that the wind comes up and grabs the pollen and begins to scatter it randomly. And what plants hope is that through the help of wind, that this pollen will land on the stigma. So if you look up here at this picture in the upper left-hand corner, the stigmas are right here. The anthers are right next door. And so what we hope is, and what this diagram is showing, is an insect, the bee mainly, kind of rests on the petals and begins to kind of rub against the anthers to grab pollen. And in order to do that, the plant tricks these pollinators by providing nectar, different colors, and plants are very, very sophisticated. It's not as easy as you think. So depending upon the nectar or the color of the flowers will depend on the pollinator, which is best suited for that plant to become fertilized. Now, in terms of flowers, we have complete flowers and we have incomplete flowers. A complete flower has all four major organs that we've talked about. It has sepals, remember that outermost covering. They have petals, stamens, which is the male part of the flower consisting of the anther and the filament, and then pistils, which has the stigma, the style, and the ovary. An incomplete flower is any flower that lacks one or more of those organs. So if we look at this diagram right here, I'll give you a second. What type of flower is that? Well, hopefully we said this is an incomplete flower, because it is definitely lacking one or more organs. I don't see any anthers or pistils whatsoever. Sepals, definitely petals, but this is definitely a great example of an incomplete flower. So the question here is, it says, how are different flower shapes important to a plant's survival? I wonder. Well, the answer is that the shape of the flower could promote the different type of pollinator methods. So, the example here in the slide says tube-shaped flowers are probably pollinated by animals. Depending on the flower shape, maybe a hummingbird is best suited, or a honey bee. Sometimes some orchids fake wasps and other bugs to kind of try to pollinate them. Because the whole point of pollination, or what the flower is trying to do, is to try to promote the certain pollinator to grab its pollen and get it towards its stigma so it can live out its life cycle, produce a seed which will produce new flowers. Groovy. Now, what is a life of the flower? Okay, what are these little young flowers, and how do they get about it? Well, remember, the main function of a flower is to attract pollinators. Okay? All living things, us included, need to create offspring in order for our species to continue. And plants have a very distinct disadvantage, meaning there are millions of flowers everywhere. And so they have to trick certain pollinators, much like this butterfly being tricked onto this flower in the picture, in order for seeds to be produced and offspring to be made. But there is a main difference between the idea of pollination and fertilization. Pollination is simply the act of transferring a pollen grain to the pistil, primarily the stigma of that pistil. Remember, this is the female part of the plant. The anther, again, is one of the parts of the male part. Well, fertilization doesn't occur until that pollen grain opens up and the sperm swims through that pollen tube, through the style, and actually penetrates the egg inside the ovule. So we can pollinate plants, but if something were to happen between the time that it's pollinated and the time that sperm swims all the way down to the ovary of that plant will not be fertilized. So where do we get these seeds? Well, basically the seeds are enlarged ovules. And these seeds develop when the eggs inside the ovules become fertilized. And it's these seeds which then are released which become new plants. And so we're going to go over the last little part of this discussion is just some basic seed anatomy. The seed coat is this protective outer layer, which would be right here. A lot of times, folks will have to soak seeds in order to get them to germinate. And that's because the seed coat is very, very hard. And it needs to be hard because seeds live a very, very rough life. Think about an apple seed. Apples, we eat them, and sometimes we throw away the core, or sometimes an animal in the wild will take those seeds. Then those seeds will be sitting on top of the earth until they're kind of pounded into the ground by other animals or rain or things like that. And so once that seed coat relaxes a little bit, it allows the embryo, which is right here, which is basically the earliest stage of development for a plant, to begin to take root. Now, seeds are pretty cool because they contain all of the food that they'll need to survive. If you ever look at a seed package, a lot of times it'll tell you how deep to bury those particular seeds. And the reason is that there's a certain amount of food that exists. If I decide to plant this seed 6 feet under the ground, there's no way this embryo would have enough food in order for the embryo to sprout, because these leaves need to break the surface of the ground in order for photosynthesis to occur. Because once these leaves break the surface of the ground, photosynthesis takes over and there's no need for the cotyledon. When we eat seeds or beans, we are getting our nutrients from the endosperm. And so there's the seed coat. There is the endosperm, often called the cotyledon. And then finally, there's the tiny little embryo. So what's interesting here is what enlarges to become the fruit within a plant. So when we look at an apple, let's say, what is actually that fruit? Believe it or not, it's the ovary of the plant. So when we're eating apples, yes, that's true. We are eating the ovary of a plant. So how do these fruits then help seeds? Well, first and foremost, if you kind of look at the inside of an apple, it provides protection. And it also can trick animals, much like us, to eat those fruits and then spread the seeds. Because the last thing an apple tree wants is its young offspring to grow right next to it. Because then both the parent and the offspring are fighting for the same resources. They want those seeds spread far, far away so that new young plant can have access to its own nutrients in order to survive. And by spreading out those seeds, once again, the new plants have a better chance to survive, which again is necessary for living things to have speciation and for their species to continue. Well, that's it for as far as the power of flowers. Thanks for listening.